You know, I used to think the technology used to make this picture was harder than anything we would have to wrestle with today, but I'm reassessing that idea. Okay, we're ready to go? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Robin, and thank you, all the people who helped me today in the archives. You all have a treasure here in Cheyenne. This is an extraordinary state archives, and it's staffed by the most wonderful and generous people. So everybody, go in and make your demands. I want to start by just asking you to look at this picture. Now, if you've read my book, you're not allowed to participate here. But if you haven't read my book, I want you to look at this picture and just shout out, what do you see? Just tell me. Union officers. Union officers. A lot of white guys. A tiny woman, a Native American. One and the same. What else? Anything else? Sorry? Not Grant, but I think you recognize General Sherman. Right war, wrong general. Mm-hmm. You read the book. That's not fair. Sorry?
Called him a cheat.
Maybe. Yeah, a cheat. Okay. There's a crack. Yep. Who's the girl? Okay.
Indian to the left, my left, way out.
No, that's just some blurry twigs or something that you see there on the far left. Okay, so I think all of you have heard the old expression, a picture is worth. All right, I think you all just came up with about 64, okay? And a picture is worth 1,000 words. I don't know what happened. I think I skipped class that day or something because I just spent 140,000 words talking about this one photograph. So let me start by telling you what you're actually looking at here in terms of a physical object, and then we'll talk about what you're looking at in terms of the content of the image, two different things. So what you're looking at here is a positive image that I had made from the original glass negative that's in an archive at the Smithsonian. And the original glass negative, somebody was right, it's a glass plate negative, is 13 by 18 inches. So the original is about this big. So, you know, think of that when you look at this very large image here. I don't want to get too into the technical aspects of how you would have made a photograph like this, but let me just give you a few details, because I want you to understand this is not a snapshot. So this is made with something called the wet plate collodion process, which was the prevailing photographic technology used in this country when this picture was made. How did you make it? You had to take your dark tent, all of your equipment, your beakers, your trays, fresh water with you to the place you wanted to make the photograph. And you had to prepare your negative right then and there. It was called a wet plate negative because you had to prepare it in a way I'll speak about in a moment. You had to expose it and you had to process it all before it dried. You had to work with it when it was wet. So you couldn't purchase a negative ahead of time and take it with you out in the field. You had to prepare it in the field. So you would start with a sheet of window glass, so, you know, more or less this size, and you would pour a wet, sticky, viscous mixture called collodion on it. The collodion would stick to the glass plate and make it sticky, and then you would float the glass plate in a light-sensitive silver nitrate solution, which would stick to the collodion, which sticks to the glass. So it's like you're making a sandwich. Then you would take that sensitized glass negative, you would put it in a plate holder with a dark slide in it. You would take that plate holder out of your dark tent, where you've been doing all of this, and walk over to your camera. Now, if your negative is this big, you know your camera is bigger, yes. So your camera would already be sitting there on a tripod because the camera would be too big for you to hold. And a photograph would take maybe a second long exposure, which is quite long compared to what we're used to. You would put the plate holder in the camera, you would take out the dark slide, and then cameras then just had little caps on the lens, and you would take it off and you would count, you know, 1,000, put the cap back on, put the dark slide back in, take this out, take it back to your dark tent, and process it. A very skilled photographer might need about half an hour to make one image. So it's nothing like today, point, shoot, point, shoot, point, shoot. So the point I'm making here is this is not a casual photograph. You see that it's not casual in the way that people are posed, but it wasn't casual in terms of the whole process of making it. So all of these people are what I would call willing collaborators. They know this process is happening, and they're standing still in these places for the photographer to make the picture. Okay, so that's the physical object. But who are we looking at here? Where are they? What are they doing here? I've seen about 6 or 7 of the paper prints that were later made from this negative. And from them, I know this, and this gentleman in the back clearly already knows it. This picture was made at Fort Laramie, about just over 100 miles east of here, in early May of 1868. And it was made by the celebrated Civil War photographer Alexander Gardner. And it was part of a series of roughly 50 large, like this, views, and 100 stereoscopic views. Are you familiar with those little stereo images that would have 2 images? You would put them in a viewer and look at them. Gardner made about 50 big ones, 100 stereoscopic views, to document the work of a federal peace commission that had been sent out here by the US Congress to persuade the northern tribes to sign a treaty that would confine them to newly created reservations. Reservations that are in the very process of creating at these treaty negotiations. Now, who's Gardner? Alexander Gardner, the photographer, was actually born in Scotland. He was trained as a watchmaker, but he had big kind of socialist ideas. And he and his friends and relatives planned to come to the US to create a utopian colony on the American frontier. For various reasons, Gardner stayed behind when the first people came here. And by the time he came to the United States, that utopian colony, which ended up being in Iowa, had collapsed. So he never made it there. But he ends up in New York and then in Washington and becomes really the most celebrated photographer of his time. He photographed America's leading political and military figures, and he photographed on the killing fields of the Civil War. He was really the eyewitness to America's bloodiest decade, the 1860s. He photographed President Lincoln. He photographed the execution of the Lincoln conspirators. Has anybody familiar with the image of Zelig in the movie? He was like Zelig. He knew everybody. He's showing up everywhere. Now, having looked at the paper print, I know who these men are. So on the far left, because they're identified on the paper print, on the far left is General Alfred Terry. He's the man who would find Custer and all of his men dead on the battlefield at Little Bighorn. 9 years after this. Second from the left is General William Harney, who's the villain of my story, and I'll have more to say about him in a bit. Next to him, just to the left of the girl, is General Sherman, that somebody almost identified earlier, the commander of US troops during the Union troops during the Civil War. To the right of the girl is a man named General John Sanborn. He was a soldier, a lawyer, later becomes very involved in St. Paul, Minnesota politics. Second from the right is Samuel Tappan, who was an ardent abolitionist. And on the far right is the wonderfully named Christopher Columbus Augur, who was the commander of Washington, D.C. during the Civil War. And he was the man who guarded Lincoln's deathbed. He was the man who decided whether you could go in and say farewell to the dying president. And they're standing around a child. On some of the paper prints, it just says Arapaho. Here on the negative, if you look closely on the lower right, somebody has written the word Dakota. But no print of the name really identifies who she is. Now, we're here in 1868, 3 years after the conclusion of the Civil War. And we're in a post-Civil War moment in many, many ways. These commissioners, these peace commissioners, and the congressmen who appointed them had all served in the war. And they'd all wrestled with the challenges of how to integrate the recently freed people into the American nation. And because of that, they came west with the wrong toolkit of fixes. They brought what worked in one context to the West, and it didn't work. They brought promises of schools. They brought promises of churches. They brought promises of blacksmiths. They brought promises of citizenship. And guess what? That's not what the native people of the plains were focused on. They wanted to secure the rights to their land. The commissioners came with pre-drafted treaties. But when we talk about negotiations, that's kind of really not the right word for what was happening in these encounters. They came with pre-drafted treaties, but they also came with the threat of force, and they prevailed. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 forced a vast number of formerly nomadic people to live on reservations. And as many of you will know, those reservations quickly shrank in size. The Black Hills promised to the Lakota in perpetuity, the sacred Black Hills, they remained the property of the Lakota for another 9 years. Perpetuity lasted 9 years. It lasted until 1877, when Americans discovered gold in Demdar Hills and claimed the land back. How many of you have seen this picture before? Wow, yeah, a few of you. It's often used to illustrate American history textbooks. It's one of the very few photographs made of the peace treaty making process that occurred in many parts of the West in this latter part of the 19th century. But in none of those textbooks, again, is the girl identified, and she's simply irrelevant. The focus is always on the men. And my project started with the simplest question. Could I figure out who she is? For a historian, this is a really weird way to start a project. I didn't set out to explain a big event. I didn't set out to explain a set of ideas. And if I was fortunate enough to learn the girl's name, I really had no idea where that would take me or whether it would take me to a story that was worth writing a book about. But I was intrigued by a kind of intellectual challenge. Could I start with a particular visual document and go somewhere interesting? Could a small story, a picture, lead me to a big one? Now, a French historian named Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie once said there are two kinds of historians, parachutists and truffle hunters. And he didn't really explain what he meant, but I think we can figure it out. A parachutist is way up here, and a parachutist is looking at big patterns. So a parachutist can track pathogens or weather patterns or vast migrations of people around the globe. And a truffle hunter, they're kind of rooting around in the dirt. And I need to tell you before I go any farther, I'm afraid of heights. Okay. I love digging deep for those little stories, and this photo turns out to have a lot of them. I would eventually learn there's an incredible span of American history here. General Harney, second from the left, was born in 1800 when the first John Adams was president. He was born in 1800 before Lewis and Clark walked west. And the girl I would learn lives until 1936, into the Great Depression and the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Think of that, John Adams to Franklin Roosevelt, here together in one picture. American history can be very short. So before I get into specifics, I want to talk just a little bit about the general challenges of writing a book like this, a book about one photograph. How do you write a narrative story about an image that captures a split second of time? We tend, I think, to privilege photographs as something that give us an unfiltered glimpse of the past, but they rarely constitute what the French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson called a decisive moment. They give us a glimpse of a fleeting moment. And here's the thing about photographs, they almost never explain it. Photographs depict outcomes. They show us what happened, but they don't depict causes. They show us these men are here, they don't tell us why. And in their focus on a split second of time, old photographs are, I think, really at odds with history. Because what is history? History is intrinsically about change over time, how one thing devolves to another, whether by design or by chance. But look at this photograph. You cannot know what happened 5 minutes before or 5 minutes after. The more I thought about writing about this picture and dealing with that particular problem, the more I thought about the similarities and differences between historians like myself and photographers like Alexander Gardner. There's lots of similarities. We both want to explain something to another group of people. My tools are words, his tool with his camera. We have to select the moment we want to focus on. We have to select the characters we want to talk about. We have to decide how to frame our story. But here's the difference. Alexander Gardner was there. He was an eyewitness. He knew what these men smelled like after a few weeks in the field. He knew what their voices sounded like. He knew what language the little girl spoke that day, and it could have been one of many languages. I don't know any of that. But since I'm a historian, I have a kind of superpower. I like to think. I tell my children I have a superpower. I can know where these people came from, and I can know what happens to them when they walk away. And the photographer does not know that. So that's how I decided to structure the book. I decided I would watch the people walk into this moment, watch the picture get made, and then follow them as they walk away from the camera. So the big challenge, of course, is identifying the girl. Okay, cheaters cannot vote on this one either. But if you did not, if you were me, if you were just starting with this picture and had to identify her, where would you look? Throw out some ideas, what sources you would look at. Who could she be? Sorry?
Primary sources.
What kind of primary sources? Great idea. And I did exactly that. I looked at the military records of this expedition. I looked at the newspaper accounts of what was happening at Fort Laramie. What else? Gardner, the photographer? Sorry? Yeah, unfortunately for me, Gardner left almost no written records, including notes on his negatives, but I did look for those. I looked through all the Indian, what called various things at this moment. Yeah, I looked through all the records of this particular event at Fort Laramie. You guys are great. Yeah, I looked through the letters and diaries of all of these men. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, I looked through the newspaper report. This was a big deal, the peace treaty negotiations at Fort Laramie, but there weren't that many reporters there, but I did track down those newspapers. Okay, you guys are nailing the sources that one would look at. What kind of ideas might you have about who she could be? I mean, why her? A daughter of somebody important. And that's exactly what I thought. Maybe her father is one of the headmen who came into the fort to sign the treaty. Of course, I couldn't find any evidence of that either. I also wondered whether she could be a translator, albeit a very young translator, because I knew that the year before, when these men were negotiating a treaty with Southern Plains tribes in Oklahoma, there was a woman who served as the Arapaho translator for them. But in the records I found, there were no women who were translators here. Okay, really happily for me, I caught a lucky break at Fort Laramie, which, as you all now know, is a national park site. And in the library or archives there, I found a little note card that was written in 1978 by a man named Eddie Ryan. And he had come through the fort and he'd seen a copy of this picture on display in a little library show. And he looked at it and he left a note. He said, "I know who that woman is. It's my grandma." And her name was Sophie Mousseau. Unfortunately for me, Mr. Ryan was dead by the time I found this note, so I couldn't interview him about what he knew. But I could see that he was 30 years old when the woman he identified as his grandmother died, and he could have recognized a photograph of her as a child. So I didn't really know what to do next. I got a copy of this picture and I sent it to Lakota Times, the newspaper that's published in Pine Ridge, because a quick internet search showed me that there were many Mousseaus still living in Pine Ridge. And I said, I believe this child may be Sophie Mousseau. I would love to hear from any descendants. And I did. Family members have a few fading stories. I mean, Sophie died 90 years ago, so it's been a while. And they have no other photographs of her. So I've shared everything I found with them, including documents buried deep in the National Archives, which would have been very difficult for them to find. So my stories now join with theirs, and they now have a face to go with the family stories that have been passed down in their households for generations. So I do want to be clear, though. I may have recovered Sophie's story, but I don't feel like I own it. I'm so thrilled to be able to share what I have found with her real family members. Okay, so I'm going to get to Sophie's story in just a minute, but to understand why it matters whether we know who this child's name is, let's do a little thought experiment. What can we learn from this photo if we don't know who she is, but pay attention to her? What if we treat her as a symbol, which many people I've shown this picture to like to do? They like to tell me that her presence reminds us of the power inequities that exist between her and everyone else we see here. They're tall, she's short, they're men, she's a girl, they're white, she appears native, they're old, she's young. But I'm here to tell you historians don't like to deal in symbols. We want the facts. And there's absolutely no way in the world, to go back to your question, to know what Alexander Gardner thought when he made this photograph. Gardner left a lot of photographs behind. So we can know he was at Fort Laramie on May 3rd, 1868. We can know he was at Antietam, at Gettysburg. We can chart where he is on these days, but we don't know what's in his head. He left almost no writing behind. So I want specifics. I don't want to just say she's a symbol. Without knowing the child's name, we might also note that her presence reminds us these men have private lives. Their military careers, their political careers are public knowledge. They're fair game for all of us. But what do we learn when we follow them home and ask who they eat with, who they sleep with, who they fight with? And that's something I tried to do as a historian. And therefore I learned that Harney is not just an aging general here, second from the left, but a man who murdered a young enslaved mother in his own household in St. Louis some decades before, and quite literally got away with murder. When you follow Tappan home, second from the right, you learn that he adopted a young girl who was orphaned in the massacre at Sand Creek, and he raised her as a spiritualist, that is someone who channeled the voices of the dead. Without knowing the child's name, I can use her to find those stories. But knowing her name changes everything. Let's talk about names. Names are what link people to the archives. Names are how we find them. And in the end, I was really lucky because we can learn more about this child than about the vast majority of people, native or white, born on the Northern Plains in the mid-19th century. A name is what it allows us to transform this young child into Sophie Mousseau, a person with a rich and complicated history of her own. So how can we know so much about her? Number one, her father becomes one of those old timers that journalists sought out around the turn of the 20th century to learn about frontier days. So he told his story again and again. Her father was also litigious, and he filed claim after claim after claim with the federal government under something called the Indian Depredations Act, seeking compensation for property lost in native attacks on his road ranches in this part of Wyoming. Her first husband committed a notorious crime right here in Cheyenne, And legal records kept track of her father and her first husband. Later, when she lives in Pine Ridge on the Oglala Reservation, the federal government keeps track of her because it's keeping track of people on the res in order to track rations and later land allotments. So let's turn to her story and talk about what it is. And I'm going to tell you, I am a truffle hunter, and I fell way too deep down a rabbit hole working on this one. Sophie exists in part because of the actions of the evil General Harney, second from the left. He is not her father. I'm not going to argue that one. But 13 years before this picture was made in 1868, 13 years earlier in 1855, at a place called Blue Water Creek, a tributary of the North Platte in far western Nebraska, about 150 miles east of Fort Laramie, Harney led a vindictive attack on a Lakota village headed by a man named Little Thunder. His men shot a young mother named Yellow Woman in the leg, and they took her baby and used it as target practice. Harney and his men killed 86 Lakota people that day. And they rounded up the survivors, including Yellow Woman, who had been shot in the leg, and marched them the 150 miles west to Fort Laramie. In that attack, Harney and his soldiers learned that the Lakota had ammunition that had been traded or sold to them by the French-Canadian traders who controlled trade in this part of the country. So he ordered all the French-Canadian traders to come into the fort. So Yellow Woman, with her leg wound, mourning the death of her infant child, and a trader named M.A. Mousseau are brought into the fort. They meet, they marry, they become Sophie's parents, and they remain married for over half a century. So the evil General Harney was an accidental matchmaker. And they do not tell that story to justify or excuse what he did, but I tell it because you have to be attentive. When you look at these stories from the past, they can have outcomes that you don't expect. And there are many horrific outcomes from what the violence that happened that day, but he also indirectly created a family. Sophie was born in 1860. And if she looks a little bit confusing to her, let me suggest, I think she's standing on a box. If you look at her, she doesn't look at first like an 8-year-old, but if you imagine that she's standing on a box that raises her about 8 or 10 inches off the ground, her legs become shorter and her head comes into right proportion for a younger child with her body. Sophie and her family grew up on road ranches in the general Fort Laramie area. And again, these ranches fell victim to small-scale raids from hungry and angry native bands. In the early spring of 1868, their road ranch north of Fort Laramie was burned to the ground, and all of their horses were taken. And they came to Fort Laramie seeking protection. That's why she and her family are here. So M.A. Mousseau and Yellow Woman allowed her to pose for this picture. And I can guarantee you one of them or the other is just out of sight of the camera's view. M.A. and Yellow Woman knew this place. They had been there after the massacre of Blue Water. It's where they met. So it was a logical place for them to come. But imagine their surprise. When they get there, they look at the horses and the corrals that all the bands of Native people have brought into the fort, and they see some of their own horses. So whoever stole them was at the fort. They also ran into General Harney. And what do they think when they see him? Does Yellow Woman still limp? Has she ever explained to her children that they had a half-sibling had been murdered? Unknowable. They also saw General Sanborn standing just to the right of Sophie. Conflicts of interest are not a new development in American history. May I make that point here? General Sanborn is there as a member of the Peace Commission, and he's going to give a certain amount of federal money to the tribes if they sign the treaties, okay? But he's also a lawyer, and he's been out there on the plains looking for prospective clients. And at some point, just a few weeks before this picture is made, he's run into Sophie's father. And he's looking for a lawyer to present his claims to the federal government in compensation for these raids on his ranches. If he gets money, it will be taken from what Sanborn is about to give to the tribe. And if he gets that money, Sanborn will get a percentage of it. You get it? It's a little messy, but nobody seemed to care. Sophie, as I said, grew up on ranches around Fort Laramie. As part of a big mixed race world that lives there, there were lots of mixed race families living in this part of Wyoming. She marries as a teenager. By one source, she was only 14. And she marries a man named Posey Ryan, who was a white Irish-born Civil War vet. And with him, she has 5 children. And in late 1885 or early 1886, Sophie's only around 25 years old. Posey falls in love with a white woman. And he basically effects a parental kidnapping of the 5 children, the youngest of whom is a few months old as a nursing infant. He takes the children with his new wife, puts Sophie in a wagon, and sends her to Pine Ridge. She had no chance of recovering her children. A young Native mother had no rights in the territorial courts. But much as she missed her children, I like to imagine Sophie might later have felt relieved to be far away when here in Cheyenne, Posey marched into a hotel dining room and shot his second wife and stepdaughter dead. And historians get their kicks in weird ways, and so I had a great afternoon today in the state archives looking at trial records. In Pine Ridge, Sophie finds a job working as a laundress at the Oglala boarding school. And she's working there when the massacre at Wounded Knee happens in the closing days of 1890. And I don't have exact evidence of this, but I'm going to spin a possibility for you. She's there watching the children who are out in the courtyard at lunch, after lunch. They have a kind of a recess time. And she's there when the runners who are running into Pine Ridge to report what's just happened. And there are Native runners and there are American soldiers who are coming into the agency to say what's happened. The American soldiers are yelling at the top of their lungs. Nobody can hear them. But the Native runners are using plain sign language. And in that schoolyard, the children understand it was a massacre before their white teachers do. It's just one of those moments you come upon and that gives you chills when you think about it. In 1893, Sophie, who's lost her children, marries a man named John Monroe, who, like her, was a mixed blood person, and a man who had been traveling around the country as a juggler in a patent medicine Wild West show. He later becomes a rancher. And with him, she has another 8 children. So that's 13 altogether. Her first was born when she was around 15. Her last was born when she was 46. So many people knew John as a juggler and then as a rancher, but it turns out he was a skilled speaker of Lakota, including some of the older forms of the language. And he becomes the most sought after translator at Pine Ridge when anthropologists and photographers start flocking to the reservation around 1900, trying to record the memories of people who remembered the pre-reservation days. So again, a moment for which I have no real evidence, but I'm going to imagine it with you. Sophie grew up in a world where she didn't know that much about Lakota culture. She lived around the fort. Her mother was Lakota, but she lived in this mixed race world of trading posts and everything. She moves to the reservation. And that's a moment when so many Oglala people are losing knowledge of the old ways. But weirdly, it's when Sophie is gaining it. Because her husband is coming home and saying, you won't believe who I talked to today. I talked to someone who knows how to build a teepee. I talked to someone who knows how to skin a buffalo. I talked to someone who remembers this, this, this. So at a moment when other people are forgetting their culture, Sophie is learning it for the first time. It's ironic. She spends the last 50 years of her life on the Pine Ridge Reservation. She lives near the children of her second marriage, but eventually one from her first. John Ryan, a man named John Ryan, who was raised by his white father, later claims a land allotment at Pine Ridge by virtue of his connection to his native mother, and moves to Bennett County near Pine Ridge in South Dakota. And here's another thing I didn't see coming. It turns out he's the first Lakota person to go to law school. Who would have known? Sophie dies on one of the last warm days of fall in October of 1936. As one of her descendants told me, it was in a simple dugout home with the door covered by a bearskin that flapped in the wind. She was a resident of one of the poorest counties in a depression-riven America. Okay, so how does knowing who she is change the meaning of this picture? A few things. Number one, it reminds us that ordinary people, so long ignored by historians and record keepers who are more concerned with political and military leaders, ordinary people have rich and complicated lives. It seems so obvious, but it's an important takeaway. Knowing this child is Sophie Mousseau also allows us to understand this photograph is a portal into a world of families and into the shifting prospects of mixed race people on the Northern Plains. Sophie grew up in a mixed race world. It didn't really matter what you were. Everybody was accepting you. But once the reservations are created, you live on it, you live off it. You're a member of the tribe, you're not. So new racial lines are about to be drawn by this treaty that's being negotiated here. More importantly, though, I think she helps us understand how endemic violence was in this part of the world during the second half of the 19th century. Think about it. First of all, there's a peace commission. You don't have a peace commission unless there's a violent situation to resolve. She leads us into a world of domestic violence. Think of her first husband stealing her children, and of course, murdering his second wife. She leads us into a world of legal violence. Here is a woman who could not recover her children in a court. She leads us into a world of military violence. That's all over this picture. And of course, she leads us into a world of political violence. These treaties are all about destroying native sovereignty. So everyone's story matters. It's not just the well-known military men who can illuminate the past for us. Sophie matters too. The Sophies of the world matter too. Knowing who she is and following her story has also led me to understand that this story isn't over. I've spoken with her descendants in Pine Ridge. I've spoken to elders at the Oglala Lakota College. A great-granddaughter who lives in Albuquerque brought her granddaughter to hear me give a book talk a few months ago. This story matters to people who are alive now. And the story, I've learned, matters in other ways too. Shortly after my book came out, I was contacted by a descendant of the man I call my evil General Harney. And he's actually in the audience tonight. You could just raise your hand. And I was sure he was going to rip me to shreds because I found quite a lot of things out about General Harney, not all of them very good. But no, it turned out that for the last few decades of his life, he has been committed to trying to right the wrongs that Harney executed in the 19th century. And because of him, I've been given some extraordinary opportunities. I was with the descendants of the Little Thunder family at the Smithsonian Institution last spring with the Harney family when they got to see the items that were collected off of bodies and on the massacre field at Blue Water in 1855, the massacre that indirectly led Sophie's parents to meet. And I was there at Blue Water last September when those artifacts were returned by the Smithsonian to the Little Thunder family. I was there as part of a pipe ceremony under a witness tree on the massacre field when the material was returned. I did not see that coming when I set out to write a book about a 19th century photograph. So these stories matter yet. Sophie's story matters. I don't think photographs yield up their secrets easily. It was a lot of work to write this book and to figure out what I've just tried to narrate to you in 40 minutes. But photographs can lead us to extraordinary stories. And yes, the stories I've told you tonight are new, but the photo hasn't changed a single bit since it was made in May of 1868. What's changed is the questions we ask of it. Just focus on the girl instead of the men, and you come up with different questions, and you get new stories. I like to think of photographs in two ways. Photographs exist in history. When this picture was made, it was part of the documentation of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty negotiations. But photographs also exist through history. In a sense, although the image itself doesn't change, the image changes because we ask it to tell us different things. We learn new facts surrounding it. We come to it with new questions of our own. So I really look forward to your questions, both those of you who are listening online and those of you who are here in the audience. But to all of you, let me just close with an entreaty. When you go home tonight, please label your family photographs, because your relatives have stories that matter too. So thank you so much.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions, and we'll use a mic so that people online can listen to them as well. Yep, hold on for the mic to come to you.
In any of the sources you checked, were you able to determine why she was selected to be in that image? And if you haven't, have you come to any conclusions or thoughts of your own?
It's like I planted that question, and I did not. To cut to the chase, I don't know why she's there, but I have a few ideas. One idea is that the photographer wanted her there, because think how boring this picture would be without her. She provides a sense of scale, of mystery, of all of that, right? And a focal point for the picture. That's one. Two is her father wanted her there. Her father has just lost everything in this fire that's burned down his ranch. Back in the 1850s, her father actually worked for General Harney. And he's probably desperate now. He probably needs someone to throw some work his way. So her father may have been catering to that. Another idea is that John Sanborn, the lawyer, wanted her there, because he's representing these clients, and he wants to prove that they really are at Fort Laramie, where they really did see their horses that really were stolen by these raiding bands. But the idea I would like to believe, for which I have zero proof, is that she's there because she wants to be. She's a couple brothers and sisters by this time, and although you can't see it in this picture, Fort Laramie is so chaotic this day. There are thousands and thousands of Native people out in these camps, just beyond the field we see here. And there's cook fires, and there's stray dogs, and there's horses they brought in, and she's probably spending all day trying to keep her little siblings safe. Like, don't go near the fire, don't touch the dog, be careful of the horse. And for once in her life, she gets to do something special without them. And I'm very wary of over-interpreting what people look like in 19th century photographs, but she does not look frightened to me. Everyone here has had their photograph made before, except for her, and she just looks straight on. It's a special day. And don't ask me to footnote that one. Yeah, over here, can you wait for a mic to come to you? It's coming right here.
I'm interested in what she's wearing, and that dress, I guess, is awfully long, even if she's on a box. But what is her dress?
If this picture were in color, you would see that it's blue, and that it's a trade blanket. So they were made in standard sizes, and she's just been wrapped around. I do wonder if the photographer showed her how to hide her hands, though, because she makes a very compelling shape there, right? When you don't see her arms sticking out. And that white stripe you see there that's the selvage of the blanket.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
With AI online, anytime you Google anything, you get AI. Could AI or one of those type of technologies have written this book?
Thank heavens, no. But great question. AI could not write this book now for a couple reasons. One is that AI right now is only scanning certain kinds of sources. It's not scanning the many manuscript sources I looked at. AI is not yet scanning digitized newspapers, except for, maybe the New York Times or something. But thanks to the wonderful state library here, I read a lot of 19th century Wyoming newspapers. AI isn't getting those yet, even though they are accessible online. So AI doesn't know how to find the sources. Number two, AI does not know how to ask a creative question. Like, AI would never say, oh, but who's the girl? AI doesn't think like that. AI could only find published articles about the Fort Laramie Treaty. But I have one other AI story to tell. My book was basically done when one of the great-granddaughters said, I just found this online. And she sent me an 1891 photograph of people lined up outside the Oglala boarding school in Pine Ridge. And one of the people was named Sophie Mousseau. Okay, so that's 1868 to 1891, 23 years later. And I looked at it, and it was a pretty grainy image from a brochure that was made for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Okay, so is that person with the name Sophie Mousseau the same person that I've spent a decade trying to prove is Sophie Mousseau? Like, please, God, let this be so. You couldn't really tell by looking. It was another short woman, dark complected, dark hair, like maybe yes, but maybe no, not necessarily no, not necessarily yes. So I reached out to some colleagues at Princeton who work with AI and facial recognition programs, and they were intrigued, and they ran it through 2 digital recognition programs. One program said that this person is a 31-year-old girl. The other program said that the woman in the other photograph was a man. I learned something important from this, although not whether they were both Sophie Mousseau. Those facial recognition programs have built-in racial biases. They are not trained to analyze dark-complected faces. They are not trained to analyze the faces of population groups that may have different facial structures. So that was instructive to me. But anyway, I think I'm still in business. AI couldn't have written the book. Yeah, all right, just wait for a microphone here in the back.
Are there other images similar to this that would inspire you to continue telling similar stories? Or what about this specific image propelled you on this decade-long journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, originally, I thought I would write about 5 19th century photographs. I would pick a railroad picture, a Civil War picture, Indian Wars picture, maybe a gold rush picture. And I would look for photographs that have unidentified people in them and, see, just figuring out their identity, change the meaning of those pictures. I pretty quickly figured out that all those dead soldiers in Antietam and Gettysburg, if anybody was going to figure out who they were, it would be a military uniform buff, which is not me. Then I started focusing on this picture. And once I found Sophie's name, which was a very, very lucky break, I realized this one was enough. I didn't need to have more than one photograph in this book. But I do want to say to all of you, think about your family photographs. So the story I told you about Sophie's parents, maybe a story she didn't know. I have no idea. Did she know that General Harney shot her mother, or his soldiers shot her mother? I don't know that. So I'm putting together a story of her life that may not have been apparent to her, which is kind of an interesting thing. But all of you have relatives that have incredible stories. And don't make your children and your grandchildren's lives as hard as mine was. Please tell them who these people in the pictures are. You know that's Aunt Mary who lived down the street from you, but your grandchildren will not know that. Please, please, please write it down. Mhm.
I have 3 questions.
Sure.
How old was she when she died, and what did she die from, and what time of year was this photograph taken?
This photograph was taken the first week of May in 1868. And I'm the kind of historian who looks up everything. So I did look up the weather reports for Fort Laramie that week. I looked up everything. I know that the weather had been really erratic, and I know that the grass hadn't turned green yet. So I actually know that's sort of the grazed stubble of last year's grass from reading weather reports. So she was born in 1860 and she died in 1936. So she was 76. And a kind of old age. There's no real cause of death listed with her death documents. Yeah, in the back.
Was there a reason that they were in Fort Laramie other than, I mean, because didn't the treaty have to do mostly with the Transcontinental Railroad? So is that the only reason they were there, or did they have other reasons?
Okay, this flurry of treaty making in 1867 and 1868 that Congress sent these men out to do was triggered by the construction of the railroad. So that's a really good connection to make. People were worried that as the railroad cut through Indian land, through native land, it would create more opportunities for conflict. Well, yes. So the point, when you look at the instructions given to these men, it was to create reservations that would draw Native people away from where the railroad was coming. And these men are here literally, weeks after the railroad finally came to Cheyenne. So they traveled here on the railroad and then got into wagons and took the road from here to Fort Laramie. Fort Laramie was picked as a site for a very big treaty negotiation because it was a very well-known site to many of the Northern Plains tribes. There was a military presence there, so these men had a place to stay and had the protection they thought they needed. And there were well-worn and well-known travel paths that made it possible for people from many different places to converge on this site. So I think that's why Fort Laramie. That's a good question, though. Yep.
This is a little far out, but do you know whether he got his horses back?
Yeah, I do know. So because these records survive. So he filed, I'm going to say it was around 5 different cases with General Sanborn as his attorney. These cases take like a half century to get resolved. Congress was not efficient on this one. After Sophie's father dies, Sophie's son, John Ryan, the first Lakota man to go to law school, takes up his grandfather's cases and tries to keep pushing them through Congress. Basically, at one point, most of the cases were never resolved. One said he would get a little money, but it's not clear he ever got it. He did not get the horses. But these cases that are buried in the National Archives are an incredible rich source for historians. Most people don't know about them, but he tells everything he lost. So when his ranch burned down weeks before this picture was made, he listed everything he lost. That means I know what Sophie grew up with. I can see that her father owned this kind of this and this kind of that, this kind of that. And I can see that the most valuable thing he had, aside from his horses, because his main business was he would take worn out horses from white overland travelers, nurse them back to health, and then sell them to the next wave of travelers who came through. But he was also selling telegraph poles. So he, in a crazy way, was a part of the modernization of the West. So the telegraphs were coming through, and he was providing the poles to the people, stringing them across the country.
Is that why they burned it?
I think they burned down the ranch for food and for horses. I don't think that I don't think they were thinking telegraph poles mean the end of everything. I don't think they're going to there yet. Yeah, got one right here. Just wait for the mic for 1 second. It's coming to you.
I think this would make a good movie.
Thank you. Have your agent talk to my agent, okay? Great. Okay, well, thank you all.
And as I mentioned earlier, we have Barnes and Noble here who has brought copies of the book, and you're welcome to purchase them. They're $33.60, and he's ready to take cash or card or check. And
Marnie.
Marnie will sign them for you.
Great. Thank you all. And thank
Thank
you, Wyoming, for being such a good place to do my research
Yeah.
and for being such a good library and archive. Thank you.
Thank you.